Though we've now completed all of the departmental budget overviews, we again begin tonight with a pre-budget workshop, this time featuring the presentation of the cost allocation plan and cost of service or user fee study. And so without further ado, I recognize CFO Terrence Beaman.
Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, Council. Here tonight to present and go over the city's.
I'm giving Terrence the pause sign, timeout sign. I'm noticing in the bottom corner, IT, it says click to join the audio. Do we know that the meeting is being broadcast out properly? I figured we ought to check on that just because there looks like a notation on Zoom that we might not be. While Faraz is checking on that, Terrence, if you want to continue on with your introduction, just before we get into the meat of it, we'll make sure that we're...
Sure. Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, Council. I'm here tonight to present and go over the city's cost allocation plan and cost of service, or better yet, our user fee study. If you recall, this was brought to the attention of the previous city manager, and it was included in our fiscal year 2020 budget. So I guess the good news is I'm just glad to get here tonight to where we have an actual study that we'll be able to review and hopefully move forward with. I would also like to thank Council, first of all, for allowing us to do the study. I know there was some hesitation about doing the study, but I'm grateful for the fact that we were allowed to do that. I would also like to thank all of the department heads. The department heads spent a lot of time on this study. We spent hours, maybe 250 to 300 hours just on our time. So specifically, I want to thank Chief Tittle. He spent a lot of time looking at emergency medical services, the type of transportations we make and where they live, things of that nature. Parks and Rec, Carl Miller, spent a lot of time looking at the type of programs we offer, who participates, where they live. So again, it was just a lot of time. So as we talked about the benefit of what our investment would be at $31,000 and how quickly we could see that return, what I have to say tonight is we got more than an investment in return of revenues. We got an investment in return of staff training and learning because we got the chance to spend time with each other. And for me, being new in the city, I've been here 5 years, there are certain things I wasn't familiar with until I sat through those studies. And so I'm grateful for that. And I'm pretty sure any new department head would be grateful for that. So I just want to thank everyone for that. And most importantly, I want to thank staff. Finance staff, Jim Harris and Todd Gross spent hours and hours over the last couple of months helping us get to this point. So I want to thank them. And then Courtney Ramos, she is our consultant for Matrix. She'll get up and speak in just a moment. She's here to help present the study. But she was our lead. She was very patient. She was very accommodating, very approachable with department heads. Numerous questions, again, just question after question, meeting after meeting. So again, I appreciate all of that time we spent on getting to that point. Now, one of the things that we are going to focus on, and we want to make sure we keep this in the forefront, is this is basically going to be a council policy decision. So what we're asking council tonight, what we will be asking council at the end of the day is, this is a policy decision. These decisions that you'll make based on this study will be discussed tonight when we make policy decisions as we start to talk about the fiscal 22 budget. But again, we want to stick to that as our policy directive is council. We're, again, going to be seeking your direction at the end of the night as far as the cost recovery goal that has been recommended by all the department heads. So with that being said, what I would like to do now is I'm going to turn it over and bring up Courtney Ramos. She'll do a lot of the presentation. I'll step in and out. This is Courtney Ramos coming up right now. I'm going to step to the left. But again, I thank you guys for getting us to this point, and I look forward to hearing Courtney for her presentation.
Awesome. Thank you all. Good evening. It's nice to be here. Please go easy on me. This is my first in-person council meeting in over a year and a half. Don't have my lucky slippers, so hopefully it all goes well. But tonight I'm here to talk to you about all the work that we've done over the last about 6 months in conjunction with staff in developing the cost allocation plan and the user fee study. As I mentioned, kind of when we introduced this study back in November, really what this does is it provides a baseline for the services that are being provided. What is the time associated with those services and the cost associated with those services, so that you guys can make informed decisions and informed policy directives. This just kind of lays everything out, and we've created something that staff can now build on going forward, that they can edit and they can change as services changes, as staffing changes, as the needs of the city change going forward. So we're going to start with the cost allocation plan overview. And essentially what that is it's a really long document with a lot of numbers in it. But what it does is it shows you the allocation of indirect cost or administrative services to all other services in the department. So, we talk about central services like finance and HR. How do they support other departments and other funds within the city? And that's what that document does. And so what we did is we worked with departments and worked with staff to understand all the services that they're providing, whether they benefit internal staff and internal departments or whether they're solely public facing, something like municipal courts. So how are they helping either the city as an organization or the city as an entity, as a community? We looked at what's the best way to allocate the services that are being provided internally, went back and forth on the types of metrics that we could and should use so that we could fairly and equitably allocate those costs. The use of this plan and what you do with it, one is, like I said, it provides a detailed picture. What are the services that we're providing? What's the cost associated with those services? And who benefits from that? It also can help justify cost reimbursement transfers. And another thing is that we then feed that into the user fee study from a citywide overhead perspective. And so kind of the next step on the cost allocation plan is to really finalize and formalize a policy that reflects what council's prerogative is as it relates to recovering costs associated with that citywide overhead component. Where do you want to go with that? What is your direction? What's the policy associated with that? Mm-hmm.
Quick thing I would like to add there. So part of our comprehensive financial management policy statements. So that's in the back of our budget document we adopt every year. This was originally adopted in 2005. So in there, section 4C talks about the city shall establish a method to determine annually the administrative services charges due the general fund from the enterprise fund for overhead and staff support. So again, that is already documented, initially approved by Council 2005, and we adopt it every year. Same policy, section 5. Can you read that back? Of course I can, sure. It says, the city shall establish a method to determine annually the administrative services charges due the general fund from the enterprise fund for overhead and staff support. And I can email this to you too if you would like. Sure can. Section 5 of the same policy statement says a little more about user fees. And it says, about the same study. It says the city shall seek to eliminate all forms of subsidization to the enterprise fund from the general fund. So again, this is already written in our policy document. Just thought I'd bring that to your attention. That is one of the items, that's one of our fiscal year 22 management projects where we're going to look at this statement and enhance it and make sure it's still relative. So just thought I'd mention that briefly. But this is kind of what we're doing as far as policy decision is tied to policy that was adopted in 2005.
So Jim Hotze, position 6. Have we, in the past, last year and the year before, did we allocate expenses to reimburse the general fund from the electrical and water fund or whatever?
No, but we currently have a transfer in place. It's just the amount is at an amount that's being subsidized tremendously by the general fund. So currently there's $624,000 that has been transferred over from the enterprise fund for about 4 years, I would say. Maybe I'm off on the years. Prior to that, it was $500,000, and I forget how far back that goes. But if you recall, that transfer amount, we really didn't have any support documentation as to how it was calculated, which is kind of one of the main drivers as far as why we were trying to bring this study forward, is to look at that transfer. So this will be the first time that we have what is called a fully burdened, fully cost allocation plan to justify the transfer. So in a perfect world, council members, that means this year, based on the cost study, we're subsidizing the general fund by $300,000 roughly. So,
thank you.
You're welcome.
And I'll just mention for the benefit of anyone listening, as Councilmember Hotze referred to the comprehensive financial management policy statements, Terrence, I believe that's also reproduced in the memo in our packet starting at 25. Packet page 25.
Sure, yes.
All right, thanks. Yeah. So just for anyone interested in following along, it's at section 5 dealing with user fees.
Thank you.
Ms. Ramos.
All right. Next slide, please. Whoever happens to be in control of the slides. There we go. So just to kind of give you an example of what we went through and what we did with each department, was that we looked at the different service areas. So the example here we have is finance. We came up with 6 kind of core service areas. And again, this isn't to get into the itty bitty minutia and the weeds of every little thing that we do, but to kind of come up with functions or buckets that encompass the majority of what it is that we're doing. So we came up with 6 buckets for finance, and then worked with staff to determine what was the best metric that we could use to allocate those things. So we didn't want to just say, like for budgeting, I think I spend this much time with this department, or I think I spend this much time with that department, but rather try and find metrics and then make sure that the percentages associated with those metrics kind of matched how staff felt that they spent their time. So we spent a lot of time going back. In some departments, it was really easy. Some functions, it was really easy to kind of come up with a metric. Other times, we kind of went back and forth, and we're taking a look at metrics, and did we need to modify metrics in order so that we could, again, get a fair and equitable allocation of costs to those different receivers. And then also up here, we show municipal courts, which, again, they don't benefit city departments. They don't serve city departments. They're there for a completely different purpose. And so those costs associated with that, were not allocated out to other departments. Again, because we want to be fair and equitable. This isn't about taking all the costs and spreading it over all departments and funds. It's about looking at what are the services that are provided, who benefits from those services, and allocating those costs.
Pardon me for a second. I think we had a question. Did you have a question, Councilmember? I'm sorry, you had raised your hand. I thought you had a question. Okay. Carry on. Thanks.
All right. Next slide, please. So in total, when we look at all of the central services that we included in the plan, we sent about $6.97 million through the plan. What actually kind of hit or was allocated out to funds and departments was about $6.2 million. So there was about $720,000 of cost that was not allocated out for things associated with like municipal courts, elections, litigation. Again, things that aren't predicated on staff. It's not a support cost to them, to those different departments and funds. Okay.
Is this slide, because Public Works is not on here, there's a lot of stuff that's not on here. Is this just the central?
These are just yes. So these are the ones who we're allocating out from.
It threw me for a loop.
Yeah. The other one wouldn't fit nicely on a slide like this. Maybe take 7 or 8 slides and a lot smaller font. Okay, next slide. I had to double check the numbers there. So like Terrence was saying, the primary purpose of this plan, what it really serves is to help outline what is the cost associated with supporting the enterprise fund. And what we've been able to do through this plan is kind of outline the costs associated with each department within that fund. What are the associated costs? And through this plan, it was a little over $1 million that is being, associated with the services and the support provided to that enterprise fund. And currently, as Terrence mentioned, the transfer is $624,000. So there is a subsidy in cost associated with that. But now we actually have something that details and identifies not only what the number is, but why the number is what the number is. Next slide. And then I'll turn this one back over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Courtney. So Courtney has just finished up the section where we're introducing the cost allocation plan. So what I would like to do now is just kind of wrap it up on this section, kind of what we're recommending and we're asking for council's policy direction on. So the first thing is we are looking at recognizing the cost associated with supporting the enterprise fund to the tune of $1,073,000. So that difference is about $449,000 difference. As I stated a moment ago, that is something that will be part of the budget presentation to be considered later on as a policy decision, but that is one of the things that we are looking for council. And the second thing is where we're wanting to also incorporate into our policies moving forward to include, as we adopt our budget on an annual basis, any kind of increases with regards to cost. So CPI, consumer price index, things of that nature. Again, just making sure we're including these escalating factors on an ongoing basis, so we don't fall behind the eight ball. So those are the two main recommendations that we'll be looking for with regards to the cost allocation plan. And so if there aren't any questions right now, I'll let Courtney take it back over. Oh, sure.
What were the enterprise fund coming up with an additional $624,000?
No, currently the enterprise fund already transfers over 624. The additional
Then it's 400,000.
Yeah, 449,000.
Okay, so that would be for the next budget,
Yes, sir.
and that's one of the two things you're mentioning.
Yes.
And what was the second one?
The other thing we'll discuss is the recommendation for the cost recovery with regards to increasing our fees, our user fees.
That we haven't gone through yet.
Not yet.
Okay, so right now, if we're looking at the 400,000.
Yes.
That's all. Have you translated that to what it's going to increase our water bill?
Tentatively, yes. That'll be discussed when we present the proposed budget for 22 based on council policy decision. Right now, those numbers are not rolled up into the budget until we got or received council action. But once that is approved by council, we will be able to set and project what rate increases will be needed for the enterprise fund. For example, we already know we're going to be looking at rate increases as a result of the City of Houston's water rate increase already. So we already have that part factored in, but we'll have to figure out a bona fide rate increase once we receive council direction with regards to what we're recommending.
What percentage was the increase for the City of Houston on the water? Was that just a little bit over 4%? Or
Kind of depends on how you look at it. We're a wholesale customer. And so off the top of my head, I had it, but I just lost it. But what I do know is the City of Houston's water for the city went up about 7 or 8%. That's what I do know how it would impact us. I just don't know what that will be in, as far as a rate that I'll bring back for your consideration. But we're a wholesale purchaser where most of the impact is going to be for the residential purchasers.
but we're going to be seeing quite an increase this year potentially in water.
Yes. The dollar amount I do know is like over 6 figures of a difference that we have to make up. I just don't remember what it equated to in a percent increase. But reasonably, we're going to be factoring that into our presentation for the enterprise fund budget. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Terrence, I think I'm going to jump in
Sure.
because that's a helpful segue, although I think we might be getting ahead of what you'll address later. But
Sure.
since it follows on what Councilmember Hotze was asking about, because I too was wanting to ask about the impact on the enterprise fund side with rates, but whether you answer it now or at some point in the presentation, I'd also like to know if staff has yet developed a recommendation on how the increased transfer amount would be distributed within the general fund. In other words, would a typical Bellaire homeowner who might see their water rates go up to pay for the inter-fund transfer see a corresponding reduction in the tax burden or more services in exchange for that money? How would that play out? And if you're not prepared to answer that now, that's fine. But I think I'd want to look at both sides of that ledger, the enterprise fund and the general fund side.
I agree with that. And right now, that'll be something we'll be discussing tonight when we present the fiscal year 22 budget. Because within there, we have several rate options for us. We have what is called our nominal rate. We'll talk about that. We're going to have our new revenue rate. We're going to have our voter approval rate, and we'll have our de minimis rate. So it's when we discuss all that and make those final determinations, then we'll know how it impacts each Bellaire resident at that time.
I guess irrespective of the different rate scenarios, really my question is, I think, more fundamental than that, which is, as you described earlier, currently and historically, the taxpayer has been subsidizing the enterprise fund. Our water rates are correspondingly reduced by greater tax burden that we pay to support the administrative services that really belong in the enterprise fund. So theoretically, if I just walked into this discussion cold, I would assume that the net effect would be neutralized and zeroed out. Now, of course, I understand that there's a difference between ad valorem taxation and per gallon water usage, and we could argue that from a policy perspective.
Sure.
But if there is a subsidy
I'll try to say it right, yeah.
between the two funds, and I accept that there is, and I think earlier you referenced what used to be a $500,000 transfer. I think that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the way we ratcheted it up, but it was kind of an arbitrary lick your finger and see come up with a number.
Yeah.
Here we've got more data to support what the number ought to be to appropriately capture the costs borne by the general fund in supporting what really belongs in the enterprise fund. So I think forget tax rates for the moment. I'm just interested in knowing not only what is the effect on the enterprise fund side. If I'm going to see my water bill go up, I may see my tax bill go down as a result. So I definitely would want to hear more about that.
Okay, we'll look into that, Mayor.
I was, and I don't know if I should be concerned about this, but sometimes if we put the money back in the general fund, that it gets spent before we reduce the taxes to the people that are now paying a higher water bill. So that's the concern I have, is when that money gets there, that somebody says, oh, now I've got something to spend.
Another way of framing my question.
Right.
What does staff intend to do with the transfer?
And we just have, when we go out and talk to the citizens and tell them that we're increasing their rates, and part of it, it would be one thing if we just had to explain this to them, but we also have to explain the city of Houston increase at the same time. So we're kind of in a double whammy. Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
So I'm jumping way ahead, but I would say that I don't know that this really matters at the end of the day in terms of how the allocation works, but if you can't simply say, I'm going to take, in other words, as the mayor said, hey, if I have to pay more in a water bill and I pay less in tax, what do I care?
Yeah.
Obviously, it's going to hit people differently, right? Because
Yes.
the people, we've had like the wettest 3 months ever in the summer of Bellaire, and people still have their sprinklers on, so maybe they'll have to pay more, right, than the people who don't have their sprinklers on.
Exactly.
But at the end of the day, I mean, this is a different decision than what our overall budget is. And if our overall budget says, hey, we're going to have $449,000 less, we're going to reduce our rate so we get $449,000 less in property tax, hey, then the residents are breaking even.
And if I may,
Fair
Yes.
statement?
Yes, but
if I may, the way we've set it out in the budget presentation, you'll see a variety of choices that council will be asked to look at in terms of recurring expenditures and recurring revenue, as well as non-recurring expenditures and non-recurring revenue. So you'll see the change in the transfer as a potential decision regarding recurring revenues. You'll see some other changes and corresponding revenue sources for the non-recurring. So I think we can get into that in earnest on those couple slides in the budget presentation.
Well, I think as a practical matter, there's a lot of moving parts, and I get that. But at the end of the day, what I think I said is relatively straightforward, and how we get there is another question.
Yes.
In other words, if you say, okay, I want to spend, X, I want to hire 20 more people. Now I have to figure out where I'm going to get that money. If I say I'm going to lay off 20 people, okay, now maybe I can, do Evergreen Park. We can do that out of the funds that we save, as an example. I mean, we should have a list of what we're going to spend and how, and have the ones that are on the cusp, so to speak. In other words, we know we're going to keep on picking up garbage, so don't tell me we're going to quit doing that, right? But there are things that there's a question: should we do this or should we not? Should we have fewer people? Should we have more people? Those are the kind of things that I think really drive it. But anyway, I actually had a more substantive question. So I'm assuming that when you do this, within you have an accounting system that basically every time you have an expense, whether it's you're paying somebody, you're paying a vendor, you're buying something, whatever it might be, you're putting it into an account in the accounting system. And
Yes,
there's a system of accounts. And essentially, and you tell me if I'm
Sure.
if I don't understand this correctly, because I could be completely off base.
Sure.
What I'm hearing you say is that as part of this process, you basically said, hey, I have all of these accounts, and I've put them into buckets, and it was up on an earlier slide, all the different buckets they were in. So within each bucket, there was a whole bunch of accounts. And then within each one of those, I'll call it a big bucket, you said, how do I spread this out amongst my other accounts? And I'm assuming that when you did that, that there's some sort of spreadsheet that like lists every account. And so as an example, it would be like, what is one of my costs? One of my costs is Terrence Beeman. So Terrence Beeman probably goes 100% under accounting. Maybe, right? I'm just, as an example. Mm-hmm. And you have a very specific account that your costs would go into. Would that be a fair statement?
Well, not necessarily a specific account, but the transfer comes over as just one line item. It is.
Oh no, I get that. That. But before you do the transfer,
yes,
I get that.
Okay.
But before you get the transfer, when you're doing the accounting, you're putting everything into accounts. And let me give you an example. Let me give you a better example than Terrence Beeman.
Sure.
When we were talking about the wastewater treatment plant, we said, hey, this is how much it. So I have an email somewhere that says, this is account number, blah, blah, blah. And this is how much we've spent on that. Well, that's good information, but it doesn't tell me. But as an example, there may be individuals, there may be payroll costs in there, there may be supplies, there may be maintenance, there may be depreciation. Who knows what's all in there? But the point is, you have a spreadsheet that would tell me what's in that account.
Yes.
All right. Yes. And you would, and I assume as part of this study, you probably would want to make revisions to that spreadsheet.
This is the way I view that. Once this study is approved by council, the only time we really will revisit it is maybe annually as we look at the budget adoption process. But more importantly, it probably wouldn't be revisited from that level until we probably did another study, which they recommend every 4 to 5 years. But in a perfect world, we had several meetings, several discussions to make sure the allocations from every perspective were reasonable, meaning my interpretation of what I think is reasonable may be different than what someone who may have worked with 40 different municipalities. For example, Courtney's worked with over, I think, 60 different fee studies, so she brings a breadth of knowledge that maybe we don't have, but
no,
yes.
I get that, and I get so what I'm hearing, look, let me repeat back what you said, make sure I got it.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing you say is, and I wouldn't have expected you to do this, well, you could have, but what I'm hearing you say is you said, well, I'm going to wait until we get this approved by council, and then I'm going to do a reallocation based on this study. And next year, when we're doing the budget, I may look at it again. And I wouldn't expect you to look at it unless you hired somebody.
Yes.
For example, you're like, where do I put them? Which accounts do I apply them to?
Exactly.
All right.
Yes.
So and I'll circle back to my original questions. You have this spreadsheet, right? And you can supply that to us, right?
Yes, definitely.
And as a result of this study, you could also supply us what your proposed allocations are.
Yes.
That would be great.
Definitely.
Can you give us that?
Yes, sir.
I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide.
All right. Well, now that we've gone through easy breezy cost allocation, we'll move on to the cost of service or user fee study. So where the cost plan kind of looked more globally at the city and the departments, the cost of service or user fee study focuses on those things for which you are charging applicants or residents for services that you are specifically providing. So this is separate from like municipal court that they're sure you're paying them money, but it's a fine, it's a penalty. While you could argue that you did something to cause to have to pay that, user fees are typically things like a building permit, a planning application. If I want to use a Parks and Rec program, I'm paying for a service. And so what this study did is it established what is the full cost associated with that. Full cost is kind of easy from a formula perspective. It's rate times time equals cost. But there's two different components in there that are really important to figure out. One is the time. So when we're looking at collecting time estimates, we worked with each department and saying kind of what is that service level. So if we're talking about a building permit, what is standard service? How many inspections is that? And building in, nobody's perfect. We don't all pass the first time, right? And we don't want to nickel and dime people every single time we have to go out there. So how many inspections are we accounting for in each one of these services? Because it might be different, If I'm building a big commercial project, the number of inspections that I might need to have at a baseline level is going to be far more than if I'm building an addition on my house. So we want to make sure that we understand what those service level assumptions are for the different types of projects that there are. And then in order to get the rate, we need the fully burdened hourly rate. And so what that is it takes into account the salaries and benefits associated with each of those positions. It takes a look at the administrative overhead. So, the pen and paper that you're using, the cars that you're driving, the admin assistants, the supervisors who are supporting you in that, as well as costs that come in from that cost allocation plan.
Rent.
Yep. Utilities, lights, all that stuff. And so we come up with this, and the other thing too is that we want to make sure that it's based on your net available hours. So we might have 2,080 hours if you took 40 hours a week times 52 weeks. But we get holidays and vacation and sick and all these other things. So when we talk about a fully burned rate, it's what would you need to charge based on the hours that you have available to charge to do that. So it's not what they get paid. It's essentially what it's costing the city to have that employee work. So again, we get rate times time equals cost. And so through this, what we can do is in reviewing all of these fees, one, we get to identify the ones that are set by outside agencies. If it's set by the state, if it's set by policy, we can identify what those are. And then we can also streamline the fee schedule. Make sure that it's, this is your one big chance to kind of go in and say, does all of this make sense? If I'm an applicant and I come in, do I know what this means if I'm reading it on the page? Can we get rid of old, outdated services? Nobody does anything on VHS anymore. Let's get rid of all of that. And let's put together a streamlined fee schedule. And so then from this, what we can do is we can, further define our cost recovery policies and our goals for each department. What do we want to recover? It also it outlines you, what is it that what's it costing us to provide these services compared to what's the revenue that we're generating? Should we be generating more revenue for these services? And then also establishing a fee increase mechanism. If we choose to do nothing, we don't increase any fees, to at least implement a fee increase mechanism so that your cost recovery level that you're at today doesn't continue to decrease. Because every year your costs will go up. And if your fees don't go up even marginally, your cost recovery level will continue to go down. So it's a really important kind of decision to make as well today. Again, if we don't raise any fees, to take a look at least implementing a cost increase factor on our fee schedule. Next slide. So the outcomes of this study, so the main areas that we looked at, development services, fire, EMS, police, public works, and recreation. Overall, there's about a $4.2 million subsidy. Obviously, there are two departments or two service areas that are the key components to that. That'd be fire, EMS, and recreation. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but there are certain things that hinder that. But obviously something like recreation, when we're deciding what it is we want to set our fees, we want to look at what's the benefit that people are receiving. Something like development services, it's a very unique, personalized benefit. If I add on to my house, I'm really only benefiting myself. I mean, to be fair, I'm also benefiting my neighbor because I'm driving property values up, but mostly I'm benefiting myself. Versus something like Parks and Rec, when we have Zumba classes, when we have swim lessons, right? We're benefiting the community also. So the fact that we have a greater level of subsidy there, the community itself is getting a benefit from something like that. Next, go ahead.
So, did I hear you correctly that you're handicapping, so to speak, some of the analysis with regard to how much you would subsidize certain aspects of this, in the sense that there are opportunity value that is created by having development services so that houses are built in a much better way, and that they're constructed appropriately, and that they increase the value of other people's properties around you. Those are things that you don't necessarily pay for because you're not building a house, but yet you get a benefit from it, the fact that you enhance value your own. Is that what that's about?
I would say generally yes. So there are certain fees that you want to look at from that kind of continuum, that benefit continuum, right? Does it benefit mostly just the person who's applying for that application or that permit, or does it also have a value to the community, the greater community?
Is there a methodology by which y'all do that, or is it just sort of by feel, or is that part of the policy that you're?
It's really more part of the policy, and certain jurisdictions have, they think about things differently. I've certainly seen Parks and Recreation is a really good example. It's something that typically, currently the 32% cost recovery is right about where we would see Parks and Recreation departments across the U.S. But now I have seen in some jurisdictions that are, we'll say more affluent, maybe, and they say, you know what? No, we're going to charge it because we can get someone to pay $10 for lap swim. So if we can get people to pay $10 for lap swim, we're going to take $10 to pay lap swim. So they'll have a much higher cost recovery level, or depending on your certain programs might be higher cost recovery because it might be a more boutique, unique service that you have that nobody else has. But it is definitely a policy decision for where you feel the cost recovery should be for each one of those services and how the subsidy would benefit. Anything you subsidize, taxpayers are paying for, right? So if you feel that there's a benefit in that subsidy, then that should be reflected in the policies that you create.
Got it. Thanks.
We may say that we're going to have a park and we're not going to charge somebody to walk into it, right?
Correct. That's how most parks are. Most of them.
I think
It sounded like we were going to collect a lot of money from a lot of people in recovery. There's some, I think, overall, somebody writes the size of a check that they write for property tax, the city of Bellaire. They don't expect to be nickeled and dimed places.
Correct.
So we need to have a balance that allows for people to know that what this specific recovering of this cost is unique to them or to this event, as opposed to I know that everybody doesn't get charged for walking into parks, but we do want to be sure that people have an opportunity to appreciate and understand how this cost recovery is being done, in that their big check that they write every year, they're getting something for that.
Absolutely, and I think that's kind of what this study does. Is it not only does it lay out what are those costs, but then with the policy direction that you provide, you're essentially outlining, what it is that we want to cover by property taxes, right? Not nickel and dime. And then what is it that we think, you should pay on your own because it is benefiting you, right?
I think kind of connecting those two dots as we're talking about that continuum, as I reviewed the presentation in the packet, I think I had a similar question Mayor Pro Tem Pappas did, which is, okay, who decides, where on that spectrum something falls, and realize, well, ultimately that's the policy decision. And so I think you've provided a framework by which we then sit back and decide, okay, a better example than walking through a park is admission to our swimming pool. And I'll disclose as it happens, my kids went there today, so whatever they paid, they paid. You're right, they don't want to be nickeled and dimed, but by the same token, someone down the street who has never set foot in that place, a portion of that is reflected in their property tax bill. One would argue there's a community benefit to having it here, but by the same token, should that person be paying more than X percent to subsidize my kids' enjoyment? So at the end of the day, I appreciate the framework you guys have provided, and maybe it's a starting point. You guys have said, we think development services falls on this end of the spectrum and access to a swimming pool falls on the opposite end of the spectrum. I generally accept that as well. But what I'm hearing is this is a starting point for the discussion that we then pick up. And yeah, you're right. We justify that to those we represent as well. How we determine what falls where on that category. But I think that's helpful. Councilmember Wesley.
So would it be fair to say, and I just kind of taking it one step further, that basically when we look at these things, there's really four categories. One in which we would say we don't have a problem with people paying more for whatever reason. It might be, maybe it's something we want to discourage, right? Or maybe it's something that's kind of a one-off and we want people to we don't want people to do that. And let me, like the false alarms, for example, that was, we want people to be responsible, and we want them to, if they have a problem with their alarm system, we want them to fix it instead of having more false alarms, as an example. Maybe a large portion of what we're looking at is, hey, we want it to be a pass-through. So if you're looking at things like water, wastewater, why would we want to subsidize it, or why would we want to make it more expensive? We would want to just do it as efficiently as possible and charge people for it. Seems to me that one of the things that kind of struck me when looking at this, and you get into the granular detail, is some of them you're saying, why are we doing this? And one of the things we may look at and say, well, wait, why are we even doing that service? Why are we bothering? Why are we charging for it? And why are we doing it? I mean, it's just a good opportunity to look at it and say, hey, no matter what, why are we requiring people to whatever? There was something like, there was a microwave fee, for example. Do I need to get a application to get a microwave? That's a very picky, but my point is, you could go through and you could probably see some things you're like, hey, why do I even do this? And if I didn't do it, somebody's paying those, right? Mm-hmm. And if you didn't require it, all the better. And then it seems to me the fourth one is, and certainly Parks and Rec is a good example. Hey, we subsidize the service, and it seems to me on those, as a policy matter, we want to look at what's a reasonable price. And it seems to me that a lot of times we actually already are there, right? I was, I think on a lot of the sports things were like $100 to sign up. I don't think we want to make it more than that. I don't know what other people feel like, but my attitude is like, hey, I had 4 kids. That's crazy. I don't want to be spending more than $100 every time they sign up for a sport. But maybe we do. I think maybe we do want to charge more than $100. But it strikes me that nothing that I saw like jumped out at me like, man, we really ought to be paying more, or having people pay more. Mm-hmm. But anyway, sorry to interrupt. But would you agree that that's basically the 4 buckets that we're looking at, or is there another way of looking at it?
That's definitely a way of looking at it. Is what do we think you absolutely should be paying for versus, what we think you should pay some, if not none. Right, and it depends on the service.
Right. And Courtney, if I may, I think the next slide really, in my mind, is kind of where the rubber meets the road on the council policy direction. We have a recommendation on that next slide in terms of what the staff and specifically the department heads had provided, and that's really, I think, kind of the starting point. I'm sorry, the very next slide. And I think all of this discussion kind of leads into that next slide to really talk about these recovery goals as we look at these 5 different departments. And we can certainly get into some of the details. You'll see Public Works and Police on there, for example. We're not talking about all services that Public Works and Police provide. We're talking about only those that are applicant-based, or those which we charge a fee for. So I think that's really where the policy direction from council comes, is on these 5 areas. And then we build the budget, we build the fee structure, we build the implementation tools to carry that out.
Any other questions? Okay. So you're right. I think the first thing to think about are the limitations associated with cost recovery. The first thing is things that are set by the state. The state says you can only charge X dollars. It doesn't matter if it costs you more. That's what you can charge. You can always charge less than what the state says, usually, on most of those. But, they do have caps on certain things, and so you need to be aware of those, especially if you're going to put in an automatic increase. You need to make sure that those fees don't automatically increase. Something like insurance. We saw that huge subsidy for fire EMS. Insurance is one of the big barriers to cost recovery for fire and EMS. You can charge $1,400. You can bill somebody $1,400 for a transport, for a BLS transport, as an example. But if they're on Medicare or Medicaid, it's capped at like $700 for transport. So you build your $1,400, you're only going to get $700. So that's already only 50% of your cost that you're getting back. You can't get back that the rest of that there. So that's one of the barriers that can come with cost recovery. The market, what will the market bear specific to Parks and Recreation? It's not just, especially if we've got swim lessons or we've got Zumba or we've got anything like that. It's not just about, what other people are charging. I could drive a couple miles and go to the next town over and maybe use their pool. But there's private pools. There's the YMCA, right? There's other places that we can take these classes, and so we need to factor that in, and not just what other people are charging for those services, but what's the market here in our city? What can our residents pay, and what's the difference between what we want to try and recover for that particular service? There might be some things where you've got a wait list a mile long. You can charge more for something like that, right? Because it's a really hot kind of program, and we can charge a little bit more so we can offset subsidies for other programs that we're trying to get out there. And then the final thing is the policy. We've got a lot of, some things like library, they might be part of a consortium. We've got a lot of different libraries, and they kind of all get together and say, this is what we think, interlibrary loans should cost and things like that. And so there's a kind of a policy directive on that. But as well as the policies that you guys set can either help or hinder cost recovery, right? If you say you only want 30% cost recovery on Parks and Rec, that's what the policy is until you go forward. And so taking a look at what those policies are, as well as things with and we'll talk about it in a little while as well, but with EMS, changing the policies associated with collections on that would be another way that you can help recover more costs. But again, those are all things that need to be thought about in the context of what is it costing you to provide the service, what's the benefit to the community, and what is the prerogative of the council. So the next slide. So this is where we get into the potential. Things like development services, public works, and police. It's real easy to increase your cost recovery. Raise your fees. That's going to be the easiest way to get there. And whether or not you rip the Band-Aid off and you just increase everybody to whatever percentage it is right away, or whether you phase increases in certain areas, because that's certainly something that you can do as well. But that would be the easiest way to increase cost recovery. And those are types of things where I'm coming in and specifically asking for a service, right? I want you to turn my water on or off, the meter on or off. I want to build an addition on my house. Those are, I think, the easier kind of decisions to make as far as cost recovery. When it comes to fire and EMS, like I said, you're hindered by insurance. So there's a certain amount of revenue you're just not going to be able to get back. But there is the other portion of that. There's the policy side of it. Do we want to start charging for non-Medicare and Medicaid patients, for whatever their insurance doesn't cover? Do we want to charge them the rest of that? Because we all, it's just like when you go to the hospital, your insurance is going to cover a certain amount, and then the rest is on you. So the question is, as a city, do we want to go after that? And who do we want to go after it for? We can not go after it for Bellaire residents, and we can say whatever the insurance pays, great, we'll write off the rest of it. But maybe for everybody else, and it might make sense too, right? Because Bellaire, they're paying taxes, right? We're paying into this funding source. But for people who aren't in here, who aren't part of that tax base, maybe the policy is we want to go after and we want to get those remaining funds. And then for Parks and Recreation, like I said, you guys are right where we would see nationally of cost recovery for those services. So I think it's really kind of taking a look at what are the services that are being provided. How do we feel like those are benefiting the community? And do we think that the prices are where we think they should be? I mean, those are market-based services. Everything else on there, you can choose to do it or not do it, right? With Parks and Rec, if I want to build, I have to come into the building department. I have to pull a permit. I mean, I could do it illegally, but then I'll get fined, and it's a whole other thing. But for Parks and Rec, I can go other places. I have other options. And so really taking a look and saying, what is that cost recovery goal? How do we want that to be? Next slide. So I'll talk about these first couple of columns, and then I'll bring Terrence up for the other two. But just to kind of put some things into perspective, for development services, the current cost recovery level is at about 75%. We typically see between 50 and 100%. For the planning type fees in development services, you'd see between 50 and 80%. And for building, you typically see between 80 and 100%. For fire and EMS, the current cost recovery percentage is about 15%. We typically see anywhere between 30 and 50. So generally speaking, when you're taking into account insurance and all that other stuff, we only really see about 30 to 50% cost recovery on EMS. So while you guys are low, there's a little bit of room to improve there, if that was the prerogative. For Parks and Rec, it's anywhere between 20 and 50%, and you guys are at about 32%. So like I said, right in the average. For Public Works, you're at 39%. And for the meter fees, we usually see between 70 and 90%. And then finally for police, But it's actually, you know, almost at the top of the range there at 66%, as the average is between 50 and 70%.
Okay, so based on the information, as a result of the studies, the next step was to follow up with each department, have each department look at their respective department fees, look at the cost recovery currently being realized by the city. They were then to also look at what the current industry standards, what that range out there for their respective area was allowing. Then the next step was to look at, we had comparative cities that were part of the study. So they were then to go and look at each other city's fee schedule to see if the fee recommended was reasonable compared to our peers. So as a result of that, this is the information that has been recommended for each department. For the Development Services Department, we are recommending a 95% cost recovery. Again, this is a policy decision. It would generate based on policy, but again, if agreed upon, we're recommending something totally different for budget purposes. About additional $424,000. That's just in development services, moving from 75 to 95. For fire EMS, we currently are about 15%, and the industry standards is between 30 to 50%. So we're recommending a 40% cost recovery. And as Courtney alluded to, policy-wise, it may generate an additional $530, but realistically, budget-wise, and dealing with those constraints, that amount should not or would not be realized. Parks and Rec, currently at 32. Cost recovery, the range is about 20 to 50%. We're just trying to bring that right in the middle. As Courtney stated, we're very, very close to industry standards, so we're recommending about a 35% cost recovery. Public Works, we're going up to about 90% from our current of 39%. And then in PD, we're very close. We're currently at about 66%, and we're recommending a cost recovery up to about 68%. As I stated a moment ago, in a perfect world, from a policy perspective, we're looking at it from one angle, but what we're recommending is what we're going to present for budget consideration later is a conservative estimate of about $490,000 of additional revenue if all of these cost recovery goals are approved by council. Also need to remember as we look at each of these recommended cost recovery goals, so for example, within the development services, some of their fees are going to be going up, some of their fees are actually going to be going down. So again, that's why we're going to be conservative with our estimate when we present information in the budget document, because again, these are numbers built on things that happened in 2019 based on current year cost. So as a result of that, based on council policy direction, we are recommending that we pay close attention to the activities of 2022 and continue to report the results of the decisions that council makes as we adopt the fiscal year 22 budget.
And Terrence?
Yes.
This is Jim Hotze.
Yes.
Will you say that over again, please? You were saying we're going to make the decisions for the 2022 budget. The budget has to be in by the end of September?
Yes. So tonight you'll be getting your first look at the fiscal year 22 proposed budget. You adopt the budget in the second meeting in September. So what I'm saying is based on what we present to you tonight as far as in the fiscal 22 proposed budget, there'll be some decisions that council will have to make policy decisions, and based on those decisions, one of those decisions will be if we incorporate these recommended cost recovery goals for next year.
When will we be making that decision?
We'll be discussing it tonight during the budget proposal, but we'll make that decision when we adopt the budget in September. So from this point until then, we'll continue to discuss it. We'll discuss it during budget workshops if needed, but you'll take formal action when we adopt the budget.
So I could see where there would be different items that we may not go from 39% to 90%. Maybe we'll take a step towards that, and that's something that we'll be able to decide between now and then.
Yes, sir. Definitely.
Councilmember Wesley.
I have a couple of questions on that.
Sure.
What is the GF and the EF?
GF is general fund.
Oh,
EF is
okay.
enterprise fund.
All right. So just looking at that first line, if you go from 75 to 95%, basically you're saying you're going to increase your recovery by 20%. So what I'm hearing, so what my assumption then would be is that the overall fees that we charge in development services are about $2 million? 20% is 420,000.
It's about, right now we collect over 1 million. So that would be,
So now, okay, so then I'm baffled. Wouldn't the 20% increase, how does a 20% increase give you 424,000 if we only have $1 million in? So you're saying right now, what is the million that you're talking about?
in 2000, we average about $1 million every year for development.
Oh, in the
revenues.
fees, not in the costs.
Yeah, in the fees.
Okay.
Just in the fees, yes.
Got it. So basically, okay, that makes more sense. Got it. So I'm a little bit on Public Works. What are we talking about there for the 34,000?
Those are meter connects, water tap setup, very minimal activity.
So we're not talking about water, wastewater.
Oh, no. That's hopefully in next year's budget presentation. Is one of my master projects.
So these are very specific. So my point is, this isn't everything in Public Works. This is just a very,
Yes, just a very small piece of their operations.
Is it everything in development services that we charge as?
Yes, sir. For
fees?
services,
Okay.
yes, sir. Mhm.
And fire EMS, is that everything that we are currently charging for?
Yeah, the focus is mostly on the EMS side of it, but we do have mitigation, but those fees are kind of set by standards through FEMA, and there's not much flexibility there. So we're mostly focusing on our EMS fees.
But I mean, to be clear, so what we're currently recovering is something like 400,000 for fire EMS, something like. I mean, just looking at these numbers.
It's about between 300,000 and 400,000.
Okay, all right, I got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Terrence, if I may, before you leave this slide, this is really what we want to include in the budget as, the policy statement. We'll come back with a fee schedule that represents these goals for adoption into the budget. But this is really where at, the policy decision level that we need direction from council. You have our recommendation here. Specifically, if you go back a slide, there's the description of what exactly those fees are for these different departments. And then on the next slide, you'll see a couple examples of fees and how they might change. But this right here is something that maybe even in this same structure, what we might choose to publish in the budget that will then correspond to the fee schedule that's ultimately included and adopted with the budget.
Thank you, Brian.
I'm going to be very interested to understand at a deeper level what we're going to change pricing on. I'm not going to do it at this gross level as far as making the policy.
Well, I'm not sure we're on the same page. Let me make sure that I'm clear in what I'm relaying. If council has a policy goal, which we will need, we're going to bring you all a fee schedule that corresponds to that. Now, that's the first step. Ultimately, council still has to adopt the budget. So if you're going through the proposed budget and you look at a particular fee and you have questions on it, that's fine. But to start, we'll get policy direction, hopefully from council on this, and then we're going to bring you something that implements it. Whether or not you choose to adopt it at that point or amend it, that's fine. But we're going to kind of proceed in that direction from the big picture down to the granular. So council always has an option to look at whatever piece of the budget they want to look at, but this is where we'll take our first direction from council on this issue.
So another kind of, the number that you said that was going to be reflected, if we said, hey, I want to do this, the total here is somewhere about 1.1 million or so, a little bit over 1.1. But the question is, then you said something about in the budget you thought that would be only reflected about 400,000.
Yeah, for budget purposes, we are recommending about $490,000. Considering this information is built on 2019 data for ever-changing variables and metrics, we felt internally the best decision would be to, again, if council approves these cost recovery goals, for us to estimate about $490,000 of additional revenue. And I think that's pretty optimistic. So.
In other words, you're discounting it because, for example, some people simply aren't going to pay and some insurance companies aren't going to pay. Some people aren't going to pay for ambulance services. Some people are going to go develop their house somewhere else because it costs too much now. Right.
That I'm not thinking. But people will be able to make choices. The one thing you're banking on is the activity that took place in 2019 that it repeats itself. So if we issued 32 building permits, are we going to issue 32 building permits or 31 building permits? And so that's the uncertainty. So again, that's why I think it's very a good tool as far as us having financial reporting that's monthly and quarterly, because it's about, do we report the information? That the assumptions built in, and I think the most important thing we can do is report the results. The good thing we have going for us in this city is the purchase of that our new permitting software, which is Dude Solutions. That software package will allow us to track widgets and units that we've never been able to track before. So maybe in a year or two, once we're looking at this fee study from another perspective, I can probably look at the number of items generated each year to see if I'm either trending up or trending down. And right now, you don't have that capability, but you will have that when we have our implemented Dude Solution software. So.
And that's, I think, the important differentiating factor is that council setting the policy goals on cost recovery. We're going to go in and, for the purposes of the budget, as Terrence mentioned, we have basically a 50% estimate for the budget. The policy decision is the $1 million or whatnot based on the data we have. So we're being extremely conservative in that actual number that we're assuming for the budget. Once council makes the final decision on the goals and we have the fees in place to achieve those goals, I think as we go into next year, we'll see exactly what that percentage of recovery will be, and that'll give us a starting point for a new baseline, if you will. So I think we're on the same page.
Next slide. I'll cover this, Courtney. This is just a few examples because we wanted to show you all what it would look like. We chose a fee from each department. So, for example, looking at development services, currently the cost is $320. Our current fee is $100. Cost recovery based on that is 31%. If we go to our recommended 95% cost recovery, for example, that proposed fee would move to $304. Same thing for fire EMS, shows the current cost, what our current fee, what our current cost recovery goal, and then what our proposed fee would be. And the same thing for parks, public works, and police. So again, this is just a good example of what the fees will look like as we move forward. And as Brand alluded to, we'll be able to provide this type of support for most fees on an as-needed basis. So we'll have that information available to you all for review. Okay, now here we are at recommendations. We kind of discussed a lot of it already, but again, one of the first objectives or recommendations is to establish and set our cost recovery goals. Again, that information was presented and recommended by each department. And what we'll do, as Brand alluded to, we'll include this type of summary sheet as part of our budget document. We'll have it somehow on file as part of the document, so I think that's a good thing. One of our other recommendations is that, based on council direction, is that all fee adjustments are effective October 1st, so meaning the first day of the new fiscal year. The third item we're recommending, as I mentioned in our cost allocation plan, we're, as a policy decision, making sure we annually include any kind of CPI increases. Again, this is to make sure we stay on top of increases rather than fall behind them. And again, this can be a policy decision on an annual basis. And then our other top recommendation has to do with our false alarms, Chapter 9.5 of our code and charter. We're going to look at updating that. I've already spoken with both chiefs, so we're going to be looking at this. And again, the goal is to bring that forward as we adopt the budget in September. So we'll be working on that over the next couple of weeks. And so we did mention, we talked about fire EMS. Courtney spoke about the limitations and the challenges we have with cost recovery in that area. So we're going to be working closely, looking at amended ordinance, again, that's with council's approval. We're going to look at how we bill non-Bellaire residents. We're going to look at how we bill those that have insurance and those that don't. We're also going to look at how we either write these items that are not collected off, or do we pursue them? So these are things we think we need to address in our emergency management services operation and program to make sure, again, that we are capturing costs that we feel, council, based on a policy decision or what you think is reasonable for the city of Bellaire. And then the next slide. Oh, wow. This is a very important thing just to remember. One of the things we do not want to lose sight of is the annual increases from the city of Houston. Historically, we just haven't been on top of that as much as we think we should be. But going forward, we want to make sure that any annual increase that is established by the city of Houston, that we make sure we pass that on as appropriate. And then the last thing, we did talk about cost recovery with regards to our credit cards. So we've looked into that in a little more detail. Looked at what the city pays as a total with regards to credit cards. It's about $135,000, and the city recovers about $118,000. So again, our goal is to have about 85 to 95% cost recovery citywide for credit cards. Currently, we're at about 87 to 88% of cost recovery in the area of credit cards. It is a fee that is just very hard to say we set. It's out of our control, but a lot of our credit card arrangements are already in place. Development services, I'm very fortunate. A lot of the credit card costs are directly borne by the customer. Another credit card arrangement we have with our Parks and Rec is a little unique in that some of the costs are just borne as far as their regular payments as part of the subscription services for having access to their software. In the courts department, those individuals do take on some of those costs as much as possible. So again, we looked at it from the perspective of in our enterprise fund and how our rates are set. The credit card portion of that is incorporated already into the fee setting process, so we feel comfortable that's being covered and recovered through that process. It's currently in the budget.
Are you
Sure.
saying with the credit cards?
Yes.
The fees that you're paying, that you allocate that across all the users, all the people being billed?
No. Currently, we just have different relationships with different credit card users. So what I was saying is in our city, if you're, say, pulling or paying for a building permit, for example, any cost associated with paying for that building permit, it is 100% borne by the customer. If you're paying for services in the Parks and Recs department and you're using a credit card, it depends if you pay in person and it depends if you pay online. It's just that unique in itself. If you are a utility billing customer, we're part of the interchange program where our city gets a benefit for absorbing some of the costs for credit cards. So that's a program we're fortunate to participate in. So that one's treated a little differently, where we're not allowed to pass on any credit card fees related to a utility billing customer and only that customer. Now, the challenge about that, I see an eye looking, is that we already have, part of the challenge, we have a lot of people participating more than we have before. As a result of that, if we were even to revert back to the program that we weren't participating in, our costs would still be pretty much the same, and that's only because we already have a lot of individuals participating. Over the last year and a half, as a result of COVID, the pandemic, just like other entities, we reached out, and these were services that we were encouraging Bellaire residents to take advantage of, so they did not have to come in person. So we strongly marketed it. We put it on their water bills, and we talked publicly about taking advantage of online bill payment. And as a result of that, we've absorbed some of that cost. But we've also done some further research, and through Tyler Technology, when we did the query out to find out how many other entities are covering these costs, we're not alone. Over 55% of Tyler customers and clients are covering credit card costs. So I just thought I would share all that.
That's a policy decision for city council, or
Yes,
is it
sir.
for the people that are running the service?
It's a policy decision in that some of the costs the city does absorb, so it is a policy decision. Some of it, yeah, you're right, it's out of our control. It's already been established. There's nothing more the city council can do about the relationship we already have with the credit card provider for our permitting software. It's already in the agreement. As of today, there's nothing we can do with the Parks and Rec. Again, it's already in the agreement. Now, what we can do is as the agreements come up for renewal, we can look at negotiation at that time. But right now, those contracts are already in place.
Now, my company takes credit cards,
Yes, sir.
and we depending on the credit card, I'm charged all sorts of different rates. So some of them are relatively low and some of them are unbelievably expensive. And the customer doesn't know that he has an expensive credit card, except he's getting all sorts of special benefits.
Yes.
Do you have those same ranges of credit card costs?
They are different. I know for courts we have a flat fee of $3, and I'm trying to remember all the other specifics. But in development services, again, that doesn't impact us because it's a fee that we never see. It goes directly to the credit card or host company. In the Parks Department, if you pay online, I think you pay about 6% of your total cost. And so that's if you pay online. And so it's just each one is a little different. I have a matrix I can share with you. I can email you. That'll provide you all the differences in the credit card arrangements that we currently have in place.
Well, you can don't do that next week. I may talk to you about this again, but we're talking about a lot of different things tonight. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Wesley and then Lewis.
So it strikes me that each area is a little bit different, and we need to look at what's really most efficient. So, for example, with the question I would have with parks is what percentage of people are signing up online now? And, you know, frankly, the credit card is probably relatively minor. It would be, how would I put it, much, much more efficient to handle it all online. You know who's signed up. You don't have nobody taking cash. If you no longer allow people to come in and walk in with money, you're probably going to cut down your expenses in terms of handling the cash, in terms of accounting for it, making sure that it all gets deposited correctly, as an example. So I think with this question, it's more than just, hey, are we allowing credit cards? I mean, I think that's one example where you just go, we need to look at the overall process. But I think the same thing is true with, so I am, I was looking at you, you were correct. I am aggravated because, you know, a couple of years ago, we didn't do this at all. We didn't take credit cards. So basically, we're talking about costs in the range of somewhere around, I mean, at least in the last we saw something around $80,000 a year. But it strikes me that, and there is in the presentation or in the budget, I can't remember where, there's a lot of detail on those costs. But again, we need to look at the process. And I would say that it would make sense for us to have a discussion about what actually would be most efficient and where do we want to be and how do you get there? How do you incentivize people to get there? And clearly, look, if you say, I'm going to allow people to have credit cards, why should I keep on using direct deposit or direct withdrawal? I mean, why would I? If I can get 1%, I mean, it's not 1% of very much, but why wouldn't everybody go to credit card?
Yeah.
I guess more importantly is, look, credit cards and especially cash and checks take a lot more time and energy to account for, right? Mm-hmm. And if you do, and look, you've sound like a broken record, but obviously if you have automatic withdrawals, you get a report from the bank. It's like an Excel file that you upload into your system and you automatically update everybody's account. Am I right?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
So it strikes me that if we figured out what the costs were, not just for that, I mean, we could give a discount. We could give a discount for for bank withdrawals, couldn't we? I'm just tossing this out there as one possibility. If we said, hey, every month it'll be $10 cheaper if you do that. If our costs to process a check, if we count all the costs of taking it over to the bank, putting in each one, you know, how much time does it cost to take to input it into the accounting system? You know, how many times are there errors? You get rid of all that human error, get rid of all that. Is that $10? I don't know. But if it is, my point is there's other ways to do this other than just simply charging for the credit card fee.
You're right.
Where we potentially, here's my next question. When did we enter into this agreement?
I think it's in the last 2 years.
The last what?
No, I think it's in the last 2 years. This is going on our second year.
Yeah, we have several agreements in place.
The interchange.
The one for utility billing.
It's about 2 years. Yeah, about 2 years.
So, okay. So when we brought this up, not we, forget about we. When I brought this up about a year ago, there was no discussion of that. Where was that? And that's not necessarily you, but there was no discussion about the fact that when I said we should charge this back, there was no discussion about an agreement that prohibited us from doing that.
If I'm not mistaken, I don't know if it was brought up that year, but I know it was brought up the year before when we first were looking at credit card increases. Because Councilmember Pollard did bring it up, and we briefly discussed it during that time. But the other thing I will share, Councilmember, if you don't mind me sharing this, there are other services that kind of are shared that others do not take advantage of. For example, we have Aquahawk. That's a service that the city pays for as a whole, but only certain residents take advantage of the service, but everyone's eligible to take advantage of the service. So there are other things that we'll look at the cost for other things, as you stated, but there are just certain things in the city that it's the cost of doing business, and some take advantage of it. We offer it to everyone, and some participate and some don't. Because Aquahawk is a great example where we would love for every Bellaire resident that owns a home to participate. Some do, some don't, but as a whole, we pay for it within that same budget. So that's kind of the way I think we were approaching it a couple of years ago before it was brought up.
So you're saying some people do what now?
The Aquahawk. Oh,
the auto withdrawal?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. No, Aquahawk.
Aquahawk.
Oh, Aquahawk. Okay. Yeah.
You don't have
big uptick
Aquahawk?
in registrations after the winter storm.
Exactly.
And Terrence,
Yes.
I think it might be good to maybe expand on that a little bit. You know, our conversations, we did some preliminary math kind of looking at the base rate and looking at the services that we provide that all residents have access to, but some choose not to take advantage of, credit card processing being one, Aquahawk being another. If we were to get out of or not take advantage of that that discount program, and you look at that compared to the portion of the base rate that you could attribute credit card processing to, in the end, the customer would be paying exponentially more than what they are now. You draw a line in the sand and you look at our processing costs for our current rate of participation, it's a relatively small portion of the base rate. That, along with all the other things like Aquahawk and just our general kind of base services. So I think that there is something to be said for the fact that it does help the residents in the end that we've negotiated that, you know, for everyone, and we have that discount that we can pass on. If we didn't, and if we did charge for that, we'd have to charge a whole lot more than what they're currently paying as what could theoretically, you know, be seen as part of the base rate. So I think that there's a certain advantage in there, assuming that we want to take credit cards, which, I mean, I would imagine that we do, but I think that we would end up having to charge a whole lot more on an individual basis if we didn't participate in that program. So that's something else to consider.
Well, I didn't say that we wouldn't participate in the program. I mean, so the point is, and I guess you'd have to look at the contract, but is if we gave a discount for people to do automatic debit, does that violate the agreement?
Automatic, you mean ACH?
Right.
Okay. I don't believe it would.
Right. So my point is, if we gave a discount for that, it doesn't have anything to do, but it would obviously incentivize people to say, hey, wait a minute, I get my 1% cash back with whatever. Or I can get X off my bill every month. Which one am I going to do? And so you incentivize people to go to the ACH instead of. And my point is, at the end of the day, I understand you've negotiated a lower rate through this consortium, right?
Yes.
I get it. And so, you know, if we weren't in the consortium, maybe we would be paying twice as much in credit card fees, whatever the number is. Who knows?
Yeah.
But the point is, it could be zero if everybody was on ACH. And so why not incentivize people to go to the ACH? Because both in terms of every level of cost, both in terms of, you know, the process, in terms of what the fees are, would be cheaper if everybody went to ACH. How do we get people to ACH and save everybody money? Which I think we should, I would think that would be a policy that we would want to try to pursue. And, you know, we're never going to get 100%.
No.
But if we could get, you know, 99%, if people came in when they were first a resident and you said, hey, you'll get your bill will be $5 a month less or $10 a month less if you sign up for paying with ACH, I think you get a lot of people signing up. Just saying.
And we can look at that. I think the answer, just based on the initial math that we did, the answer might be that it might cost us more to incentivize those individuals off of credit card than what we would gain in saving the processing fees. But we can certainly put that math together for you. I think we're almost there anyway, kind of in a roundabout way. So we can provide that.
Councilmember Lewis, and then Fife.
That was pretty much the question I was going to ask about credit card versus check, because I will confirm it was just when we had this discussion last August, because I remember Councilmember Fife very astutely asking, would the credit cards, would the processing checks and cash cost more than the credit card fee? And that was one of the answers we were hoping to get out of this study. So we don't have that answer. Is that correct?
I have something. I don't have it as part of this study, but I think I have something we worked on a little while ago, and I'll
All
put
right.
that back
Okay.
up, see what I can put together.
We'll prepare a memo to that effect and kind of revisit the work that we've done and put it in this context.
But it is interesting, the discussion of, street runs both ways, as they say.
Councilmember Fife.
As I recall, when we had this discussion a couple of years ago, one of the questions that drove it was, what is the cost to the city for checks that don't clear? And then you have to go back, and that can be very time-consuming and costly in terms of staff time.
Yes.
In addition to, since these are utility checks for Bellaire residents, there's a public relations and unhappy citizens experience that goes with that. So there's a balance in there. And there are folks amongst our citizenry who are, and I happen to be married to one, who like writing checks and putting them in an envelope and putting a stamp on them and taking them to the post office. And then there's this wonderment when they don't get delivered, or when one gets delivered and the other one is still bouncing around somewhere.
Yes.
There are folks who have used that system for years and years and years, and they're comfortable with it.
Yes.
I have converted the one in my household now because I have said I won't mail those anymore. I'll open it and I will go call them and I will do an electronic transfer and then I'll give it back to you. And you've simply wasted a stamp.
That's right.
But it's what a number of people have grown up with and they're comfortable with. Yeah. And I'm quite certain I don't have the only one. No. I've told him he's a dinosaur, but I don't think he's the only one. Yeah. So you're right. That is the most efficient way to do it.
Yes.
Congratulations if you can get us all converted, okay?
Exactly.
Mayor Pro Tem Pappas.
So just as I've been listening to, it occurs to me that there's going to be, and maybe I just didn't study it well enough to appreciate this aspects of it, but I looked at recommendations, cost of service, user fee study. First bullet point, cost recovery goals will be instituted for each department and will be adjusted as necessary to maintain revenue projections, et cetera. So I get the policy aspect of this. I think that makes perfect sense. We have goals, idea. We know what other people are doing. We know what our costs are. We know we have the policy of how much we want to recover, what we want to recover, what we think is appropriate to recover. Going through that process, incentivizing people to do certain things that save us money. All of that is all very well and good. Somebody's going to ask the question at some point in time, okay, well, if I'm being charged all these things and you're going through this whole process, then what am I paying taxes for? Which is, again, part of the policy. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, is the answer to that question, is the flip side of this question is, okay, we understand what things are out there that you can charge for, but then the flip side is balancing it out with, okay, what value are you receiving for the taxes that you do pay? And I know that we have in the past done comparisons between what services we have mm-hmm. And what we pay and what other cities pay and the exemptions that exist. And so making adjustments for all of those differences, we have a pretty good idea of where we fit sort of in the panoply of cities mm-hmm. at our level, et cetera, et cetera. But I do wonder if it wouldn't be fair as we evaluate all these things to at the same point in time have the check and balance of with what's left, what are we getting for what's left? Mm-hmm. And I do think that it's important that whether one, we have that information or at least have an understanding of it, and two, can answer that question, because otherwise I'm going to ask that question. I mean, why am I giving you $3,500 or $4,000 a year if I have to walk in and pay for fees at the pool every time I go there? Or if I have to pay for this, or if I have to pay for this, or if I have to pay for this, separately, independently, one way or the other, I'm going to be asking, so is my real rate X? And I get the saving side, but I just think that's important that we don't lose sight of it. And I know that that question is inherent in many of the questions that have been asked here. Yeah. But that I think will be helpful to us in making these policy decisions.
Yes, and I do agree with that, and I totally understand that, and I think as Courtney spoke to earlier, it's just a matter of how we look at the services and who's getting the benefit. We look at a global benefit mm-hmm. from the masses. Most of those benefits are subsidized, and your taxes pay for those. And the tough part is when you look at the other side of the equation, where it's more of a personal benefit or a private benefit. Those are the ones, again, through these type of studies, those costs are usually not supported by your tax base. So I think you're right.
Case in point,
yeah.
When I was in Greece the last couple of weeks, I went into my bank over there, and they decided on July 1st, of course I showed up on July 3rd, to no longer allow you to use your little bank book that I have seen in several iterations for now going on 30 years, to allow you to just on your own walk in there and stick it in a little machine, and it just sort of updates it for you, and you can see exactly what your balance is, what you've been charged for, et cetera, et cetera. They chose not to do that anymore, and all of this is online. Well, I can guarantee you the numbers of computers per capita for the people in this particular town, you can sort of, by percentage, I can count it on this hand. And so I'm looking at this thing, I'm like, okay, fine, I can do that. I've got a laptop. I can figure all this out. I can put in a few numbers. But I'm just looking at all these little old ladies and all of these little people, these farmers and all these little agricultural types, and they've just got to be going, so I'm either going to have to come talk to this teller the whole time, I'm going to have to buy a computer, I'm going to have to figure all this stuff out. And so it's a perfect example of sometimes we just outpace our usefulness, and then they become unuseful, and the people are just, screw it, I'm not going to use it back and put it under my mattress. And I just think that's important for us to consider things like that.
Yeah, definitely, Mayor.
And if I may, Council Member, I think you're absolutely correct. Mm-hmm. I'd like to point out a couple things that we're not necessarily changing our philosophy on any of the fee-based or applicant-based services that you saw. What we're looking at is basically a market adjustment, if you will, to align with a certain goal on cost recovery for those. When you're talking about, fire suppression, police protection, the green space on for parks, that sort of thing, anything not recreation based where they're charging a fee, those things are still all subsidized, through the tax rate, and they're paid for through the tax rate. When we get into the budget presentation, in one of the forecast slides, we actually have a breakout of those recurring expenses that are supported by other revenues, sales taxes, fees, that sort of thing, and property tax revenues. So there's an interesting breakout there. But I do want to at least somewhat assure you and the rest of council that this isn't a radical change. This is simply more of a true-up, if you will, in terms of cost recovery, in terms of how much the subsidy should or should not be. And that is definitely absolutely a council decision. And once we get that policy direction, you'll see what that looks like in terms of a fee schedule. And then you certainly have the prerogative as a group to say, whoa, let's scale back on this. Or, well, you know what? Why are we only doing this for this fee? That sort of thing. So we'll have plenty of opportunities to go through that. What's most important is that we know where you all want to be on those categories.
Makes perfect sense.
Thanks, Brian.
And I appreciate it. And I think you guys are on the right track on that. I think part of this process is for us to give you a little bit of feedback
Absolutely.
in terms of so that it helps you
Yes, sir.
pinpoint some of your efforts.
Yes, sir.
At least that's my thought.
Councilmember Lewis.
Yeah, I appreciate your presentation. I did spend some time with the information in the packet on Friday night for several hours, and then again last night for several hours, and then again this morning. I got some input on that, and I have about 4 questions here.
Sure.
So some of them overlap with what's been discussed, but I think probably the number one most important one in terms of how the cost were assessed, how they were evaluated. If you would go to page 31 out of 191, and I realize page numbering may be different for some people, but mine says it's 31 of 191. And it says number 3, cost allocated through the plan. And on the top line there in that table, it talks about fixed assets.
Yes.
And so those fixed assets that are being reallocated from the enterprise fund to the general fund, what is that equipment? It's worth a little over $1.5 million. But what kind? Is it buildings? Is it cars?
It's everything. It's the annual depreciation cost for all of the city's fixed assets.
Okay. So my question is, isn't a depreciation a non-cash expense?
Yes, but it's still a cost. So you still look at it as a cost to be allocated.
But when you say you're transferring that cost to the general fund, is that because the general fund has an account where we're setting aside that cash to buy? Like if I need a new car, I've saved my money so that I know next time I will have money to buy a new car. Is this going to be set aside?
This, as you say, this is a non-cash entry. It's just the cost of doing business. So when you look at the cost that we're allocating directly, it's the cost of doing business for that year, and that's the reduction of our value of our assets, which are capital assets. It's not really, say, cash moving anywhere directly. It is just the total amount, inclusive of all of your central service departments, because again, that's your total cost, and it's allocated. It's allocating it to the receiving departments. Because again, the way we're looking at this, we're not leaving any cost on the table. The policy decision that you make just makes a decision on whether or not you recover that 100%. Or, again, that's why most entities reduce that amount of coverage because, again, you may not want to recoup every single cost, but you want to look at every cost. Again, this is when we said fully burdened, that's what we meant. It's every single potential cost, and that means the depreciation of your capital assets are included.
So the capital assets, most of them are paid out by bond funds.
This is the value of your streets, your roads, your buildings. It's just For example, if you have on the books, you spent.
So that was
$20
paid for out of bonds, though, not out of the general fund.
It depends, but it could be. It would be your
Okay.
roads, your streets. It would be
And
everything.
then, then it's non-cash. As a depreciation, it's non-cash. But we're saying we charge this against the general fund is supposed to be reimbursed for this cost, even though, excuse me, let me ask Terrence the question, please.
Oh, I was just
Okay.
coming up to help answer.
Thanks.
Let me ask Terrence the question, please. So we're saying that that it's a non-cash depreciation. It came out of the money for the purchase came out of bonds, and yet for some reason we need all this extra spending. I call the general fund our spending money. We need all this extra spending money in the general fund because of a depreciation. It's non-cash and it's paid out of bonds. That doesn't make sense to me. The city wants us to pay back the general fund. Is that what it's doing? Now, please let Terrence answer.
It's not just items that were purchased out of your bond funds. It's all of your fixed assets. So we have Fund 610, we have Fund 620, we have Fund 600.
Well, I can see the ones that are paid out of general fund if you set aside that money for the next purchase. But if you're not setting aside the money, it's non-cash. You know, if you're not setting it up and the next time you need it, where are you going to get that money?
Yes. This is just looking at the total cost to be allocated on an annual basis. So some of your costs are easy to identify. They come out of your operating budgets. But on an annual basis, when we do our CAFR, we do our financial statements, we do a reconciliation at year end that recognizes the depreciation of your assets. We do it every single year, and we've always done it. It's just part of your financial statements at the year end.
But actually asking the enterprise fund to put that take cash out of the for a non-cash depreciation, you take cash out of the enterprise fund and put it in the general fund.
Councilmember, if I may.
Could I wait. I think we have a just basic misunderstanding of how depreciation works here. If I could interrupt.
Sure.
Because depreciation is not, I'm putting money aside.
No.
It's like if you bought a computer, you don't expense it. And you say, okay, over 5 years, say you have a $1,000 computer, $200 this year, $200 every year. Well, if in fact that computer is being used in the enterprise fund, then why wouldn't you charge that you bought it for $1,000? Why wouldn't you charge that $200 to the enterprise fund? And I'm sorry if I'm putting words in your mouth, Terrence, but did I do a good job of accounting of how? But and let me say one more thing. We don't depreciate streets, do we? I don't think we do.
Yes, we do.
Wait a minute.
You do, sir.
That is a requirement, actually.
That was Gatsby 34, and I forget the year it was implemented, but yeah.
So we depreciate our streets.
Streets, infrastructure, everything.
But in terms of the of the transfer and the depreciation, Terrence, would it be fair to say that, like, for example, when finances costs are allocated to the enterprise fund, you operate in City Hall?
Yes, sir.
The portion of City Hall and depreciation for finance is what makes up that portion of the overall cost for finance in terms of your building costs, correct?
Yes,
okay.
Sir.
Does that help, Councilmember Lewis?
Yes.
I would like you to actually probably come back to us with a more concrete list about what is being depreciated, because I understand cars, vehicles, computer equipment, but then it's a surprise to Councilmember Wesley, streets and drainage. Yeah, of course they do wear out over 50 years or so. They will
and that's
wear out.
not a portion of the transfer, but anything in terms of fixed assets that finance, for example, would use would be included in the finance cost that's allocated to the enterprise fund.
All right.
So we're saying we buy a new fire engine, and and that came out of our general fund to buy it.
Yes, sir.
And so the following year, do we depreciate it?
All of our assets are depreciated. Yes, sir.
So it's someplace typically in business when we allocated, we have an asset over here of unallocated costs. So the fire engine's sitting over here on some sort of balance sheet, and then we're taking the annual depreciated amount. If it's 10 years, it's $5 million. You do 500,000 every year, and reduce the amount that fire engine is on the asset book.
Yes, sir. In very generic terms, yes. And once again, as Terrence and I both mentioned, that's a requirement of the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, or GASB. So we do have to account for our fixed assets in that manner. But the fire truck is not going to be something that we charge the enterprise fund for.
Well, that's good. But I was at the same time. Once we paid for it all in 1 year, and it's out of the general fund, and somebody's been paid for it. But you're usually matching. In business, we match income over this expense, and I don't understand. I'm going to have to do some studying on this accounting stuff. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Wesley.
Oh, wait, I
So-
didn't get my 4 questions. I had 4 questions.
All right. Look, I was just going to follow up on that, but go ahead.
Go ahead.
Have
Go
it.
ahead. I yield. Oh, go ahead. I was moving on, but yeah.
But I was just going to clarify. We're not talking the 1.5 million that is in there. We're not talking roads. We might be talking buildings, and we might be talking things like computers and things like that. But we're not talking roads.
To be safe, what I will do is I will pull the backup and get that to you in a weekly memo this week.
All right.
To
thank
get to
you.
that
That's
number,
all.
just
I was
to be
trying
sure.
to clarify that. Sorry. Go
I
ahead.
will make sure I get that to you.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, so I've been waiting patiently. Another thing, I asked you, there was a little bit of discussion earlier about how the $449,000 that would be transferred cash from the enterprise fund to the general fund, how that might affect the tax rate, and you said there's no effect on the tax rate?
I didn't say there. I don't know what the effect will be. I said what we're going to do is we're going to present a budget later on to be considered to adopt a potential tax rate.
Okay, so this, you can tell me, my math is
Sure.
probably too simple for you.
No worries.
But I took that, remember the assessed taxable value that you helped me find?
Yes.
The assessed taxable value of $4.975 billion dollars and the $449,000. And if I just take $449,000 and divide it by the $4.975 billion, then I come up with about 9.03 cents per $100 of valuation. That would suggest that we should be seeing some sort of lowering of our nominal tax rate. I've learned this term now. Nominal, he just means that's what we had last year. And that would put us down about 0.357. And so I'm wondering, are we going to see that impact on our budget? Take it down. Otherwise, we've got this huge influx of cash into the budget, and where's it going? We're going to find that out when we do budget. Where's it going?
And I think based on the value of a penny, though, I don't think it's quite even at a penny. I think it'd be a little bit less than a penny.
9 cents. 9 cents per $100 of valuation.
I don't think that's quite right. I think that's too high.
Okay, well, we'll figure it out, right?
But we'll walk through it with you.
That'll be a follow-up question to show us a little bit how you got to that. Okay. Then I had another question just about the policy statement, which I realized was adopted in 2015. And I wanted to go back to, if this thing will let me, I want to go back to page 20 of 191. Because when it comes to raising water rates, there's a couple of things that I think, that I would think we would want to take into consideration. Actually, page 19 of 191, it talks about having, in the introductory line, having design, maintain, administer fee structure that will assure reliable, equitable, diversified, and sufficient revenue stream to support desired city services. And so, I question for one thing, if you transfer the entire burden of the water supply, of the water fees and garbage and so forth to fees, then that's not diversifying it, that's consolidating it. And as you have drought years and very hot summers or other times when you have a lot of water uses, your revenue goes up. And if you have good years like we've had in the last couple of months, then your water use is probably going to go down some. Those swimming pools don't need quite as much water input to them. But so I would just question that. Is this really meeting that goal of being diversified if we consolidate to simply putting it on the fees, putting in the cost of the water bill, the water rate?
Well, I guess my simple answer would be, council member, we're going to propose a budget that allows us to meet our 60-day year-end reserve requirement. We're going to provide a budget, an enterprise fund that allows us to operate functionally, and based on today's information, we will present a rate at a later time that incorporates, if council approves by policy decision, the increase in the enterprise fund transfer, and so on. So,
so I'm just questioning, while we're talking about fee study and the objective of the fee study here set by policy, I wanted to question how that fits with this stated policy.
And Councilmember,
so maybe that's a debate for
I think what that refers to is looking at the general fund and having a diversified set of revenue to support operations. And to some extent, we have a decent mix for a city like Bellaire that is primarily residential. But other cities have maybe even a 50-50 property tax, sales tax mix. I actually like the fact that we're fairly heavy on the ad valorem side. It's much more predictable. It's much more of a safe form of revenue. But we certainly don't want to have all of our eggs in one basket. And when we get to the fiscal forecast, as I mentioned earlier, when Councilmember Pappas was asking his question, we'll show you kind of what portion of the recurring expenditures in the general fund are paid for from property taxes and what portion of those expenditures are paid for from other revenue sources. Okay. So that'll also give you a good idea as well. Okay. But I think that primarily refers to revenue supporting the general fund, not necessarily an enterprise fund which charges fees for its service and tries to recoup its cost as much as possible.
Okay.
Is that fair, Terrence?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
So on page 20, though, as I read down a little farther in the document, I get the idea of where services provide a general public benefit, the city shall finance those services through property and sales taxes. That makes sense to me. Okay, but then it also says, kind of like that first paragraph after the numbering and lettering, it says, once a fee has been proposed for a particular service, the fee will be compared to other entities, evaluated for potential effects on users such as low-income households. Mm-hmm. So the one thing that I would be concerned about our raise and our increasing water rates is the effect on the lower-income households who are already downsized in townhouses, and they're already limiting, and families with kids, and they pushed every dollar. They pushed every dollar that they can. But I want to know: is there a way to evaluate that against the impact on the low income?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Typically, your smaller homes and your townhomes are not going to use nearly as much water as, let's say, a home site that has half an acre, a pool, sprinklers, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So when you're looking at the mix on your water rates and how you take in fees there, mm-hmm. obviously your more stable source of revenue is that base fund, and that's distributed across every single ratepayer. However, if you wanted to shift that burden, and we can certainly take that direction from council as we're looking at how we would incorporate whatever increase on the water rates, shifting it to the volumetric, while it's kind of less certain in terms of the volume of water that people will use, that's how you can affect that in terms of the water rates. You can shift that to those users that actually use more, and you can charge more on the volumetric side than on the base side. So a good mix there, I think, could accomplish that goal.
Okay, and I would use the same argument that that Mayor Pro Tem Pappas used just a minute ago about development services, how the rising tide floats all boats. If you've got nice houses, then values go up. But also, if people can afford to water their yards, then the whole neighborhood looks better. If the yards are landscaped and they can afford to landscape them and water them and so forth. Okay, so, but also, let's see. My other comment, I will wait until we talk about budget. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Councilmember.
Council, I think we kind of been jumping in with our questions as we went through the presentation, and a lot more just now. Are there further questions, feedback, Councilmember Wesley?
So I'd like to look at page 75 of 319, or I'm sorry, 76 of 319.
Look at the full
It's also
PDF.
page 32 or 70 of 191.
I'm off on the page.
Depending on which, it's the fixed assets allocation summary. Well, how many pages do you have?
If you look at Matrix Consulting Group in the footer, it's page 32.
Right,
Of
Correct.
the packet as published, it's page 76.
right.
Or for this agenda item, it's 70 of 191. There's a lot of different ways it's
Right.
numbered. So,
So,
Courtney,
yeah.
if you go to your page 32, Matrix.
I see it. I'm there.
All right, so actually, the question that Councilmember Lewis raised about fixed assets and depreciation, I think, is answered by this chart. So city manager's office makes plenty of sense. In other words, what you're saying is the city manager's office uses $126,000 worth of the building, $64 worth of equipment, apparently, for $126,000 of fixed assets that now would be attributed to the enterprise fund.
Yes. So it goes to city manager. Manager gets allocated out.
Right. So that makes plenty of sense. I get it. And I'm assuming that if we go back, or that there is, and I probably lost it, but there's probably a page somewhere that tells me how much of the city manager's office is attributed to the enterprise fund.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes. I mean, if you go to the city manager's section, you can see based on the, so it wouldn't show you based on like this 126, how much of that 126 got allocated to the enterprise. It would show you in aggregate all of the city manager, direct and indirect, this fixed assets being an indirect piece. How much of that is then proportionately allocated?
Well, okay. So you're saying, let me repeat what you just said and tell me if I got it. So there is a page here for the city manager's office that would give me the total for the city manager's office. And then all I'd have to do is divide 126 as the numerator and the total as the denominator. And that's what you have attributed to from the city manager's office. Is there a particular page? I have a feeling
Yeah.
you're going to point out a page.
73 of 191 or 79 of 319, depending on. 79 of 319.
All right, but now I'm even more confused. That is not the total.
So what that does is it shows you the city manager's direct costs are the 779,221.
Okay, so all we're looking at with the 126 are the fixed assets. I get that. But at some point, there's an allocation to the enterprise fund.
Correct.
And what page is that on?
So if you flip specific to the enterprise, okay, so the city manager, if you flip to just 2 pages, so 81 of 319. I'm sorry.
75.
Oh yeah, or 75 of 191.
So
So if you look here, so the city manager, you used one metric to allocate its costs, it was FTE. So the enterprise fund, you'd have to add them together or you could look individually. But the percentage is under allocated percentage. You could take that and apply that to the 126 and say this is how much of that 126 then is being allocated to the enterprise.
So is there anywhere where you've actually set out what the allocation is, for example, for the city manager's office for the enterprise fund?
That would be this page here. That shows because, so we used a singular metric to allocate all costs associated with the city manager's
So you're
office.
saying 2.7%, 2.74%?
For meter reading?
No.
2.74. Oh, no, that's
That's
cost going back to the city manager.
Okay, so what percentage of the city manager's office is going to the enterprise fund? I mean, that ought to
So
be a fairly...
if you go down towards the bottom of that table, starting with the 500s, that's the enterprise fund. And the enterprise fund is broken out by department. So utility billing and meter reading gets 1.096%. I think the largest percentages are for water distribution at 2.192 and wastewater collection at 3.836, and then solid waste at 7.123, the very last line.
All right, so to be clear, if I add up all the 500s, that will give me what? Is there anywhere you break it out? Where you add that up?
Where I add up this specific percentage? No.
Right, okay. But I mean, wouldn't that be a little bit... Okay, so now let's go back. I think that would be very helpful to know what we're allocating. My point is, you've done this study and we've done these allocations and you haven't told us what the allocation is. And I can add it up. I got a calculator on mine. But I think that would be very helpful to have that so we'd know what your actual results are. Now, let's go back to that page 31. So I understand why the city manager's office would be allocated human resources, city clerk, information technology, finance, facilities, get all that. So why would I allocate fire and police to the enterprise fund?
You're not. So what this is it's saying, so there's a narrative page a couple of pages before that, but what you're doing is looking at what are general fund owned assets, what is the annual depreciation associated with those assets, and allocating that cost. So what we did with where you see fire here as an example, that's the cost of fire's assets. So when we're looking then at showing, the fully burdened cost of fire.
So the 1.5 million is the total for everything, and it has nothing to do with how much was actually going to be allocated to the enterprise fund.
No.
All right. So so what you're telling me though is I would need to know what that percentage is for each of these categories. And actually, this is a great sheet, page 32. I would need to know the percentage, whatever that was for the city manager's office. Say that's, I didn't add them up, but it's about 12%. No, we're
Page
still on
70,
the same.
70 of 191.
We're still on the same page. So I would need to know what the percentage was for the city manager's office, percentage for human resources, and so on, the ones that were allocated to the enterprise fund, and then I would find out how much the fixed assets are that are going to essentially be allocated. The depreciation for those fixed assets will be allocated to the enterprise fund.
Yes.
All right. So look, I think it would be very helpful to have those numbers. My point is, you've given us kind of the conclusion, but not how you get there. And I had to just ramble on for 10 minutes here to get a very simple answer. I want to know what those percentages are. Can you get those? Can you do that?
Sure. Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
We can get that to council in a future weekly memo. And just as an aside, I have done cost allocation plans at other cities where they did actually take a portion of police and have enterprise pay for that because the police department would, for example, pass by and the wells and that sort of thing. So I don't know that we did that here, but just as an example, that does occur.
No, I would appreciate that, but I mean, obviously, with the way this chart looked, it appeared that the number was huge, and that doesn't make any sense.
No.
A small percentage, I get. No. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
And council members, some of the information was as part of the reports. It's just not summarized that way. So again, we're going to go in and pull it together. Thank you. No problem.
What have we got further, council? I'll just say by way of feedback to Terrence and Courtney both, just how pleased I am with the way this project has turned out. When you go back to the original discussions and we were debating the merits of whether or not to get into it, I think the fact that we spent 2 hours tonight just going through your presentation, very fulsome report, lots of detail. I've looked through it. I don't pretend to have read every single page, but there's a lot, and I intend to go back and through it several more times, but there's a lot of good information in there.
Yeah.
And I think tonight we've kind of scratched the surface of the policy decisions to be made, but the information's clearly there. And as Terrence said at the outset, I mean, obviously it's as anticipated, as we expected going into it, it's obviously paid for itself. And even if of course, it's paid for itself if council assumes to implement the policy recommendations in order to pay for itself, but I would argue that even if we don't, it's paid for itself in the sense that we now have a more informed basis on which to make decisions, since we can now quantify the extent of the subsidies that as a policy matter we would be deliberating whether or not to maintain. So frankly, I think it's exceeded my expectations of what the final deliverable would be, so I just want to say thanks for that.
Appreciate that, Mayor. And if anyone does have any follow-up questions, if they could email Brant or email that budget email inbox so we can keep current with your concerns about this, please let us know.
Anything further? Hearing none then, that concludes the presentation. So thank you both again.